which are now cited over 7,000 times. So they are pretty foundational for the field. And the way that what we identified was really 6 core mindfulness-based practices: focused attention, open monitoring, constructive practices, which are loving kindness, metta, those kinds of practices, movement-based practices like yoga, everyday mindfulness like mindful eating, which Jean will talk about, and breath work. Breath work is more of a recent addition, but there's now being more additions of manipulating the breath through yogic pranayama traditions. And then there's 4 primary mechanisms that I focus on for transforming the self: awareness, regulation, transcendence, and integration. So those are the primary mechanisms. But in a new chapter that I'm just putting out, it's coming out in the Handbook of Mindfulness and Self-Regulation, I've identified 18 second-order factors that contribute to the transformation of the self. So I'm only going to talk about meta-awareness, decentering, and non-dual awareness, and pro-sociality today. Okay, so in an attempt to map out these sort of changes, I'm going to talk about this idea of unpacking the human phenomenological experience, really, by describing a phenomenological experience of being self in the world. And I describe this as the I, me, mine complex. So, I, me, mine. Okay, so critical to our understanding of our conscious experiences is really exploring how one's mental habits can be viewed in a relational way to the other, and this is represented here, that we have our needs, our wants, our fears, our expectations that make up our self-identity, but also the insight into how we can empathize with other individuals. And you can see here, I'm just going to move around a little bit too, you can see how there's different perspectives, right? Each of us have a different unique perspective. And this is what we call the relative reality, our experience of the world. And when we can be aware of this relative reality, we can also recognize that there is an absolute reality that we don't have access to. But some of our experiences may overlap through our relative experience, right? Our relative experience sometimes overlaps with others, and there is an absolute reality that we don't have access to. So here's the way that we can understand the I, me, mine complex. It's really a metaphor, and it's represented here as a cartoon of a house. And in this metaphor, the I and the feeling of being a self in the world is represented by the structure, this foundation of the house. It's a primary identification point. It's what you see first, it's what you identify with. And just like rooms have different purposes, a kitchen, a bedroom, a living room, a dining room, we have different roles, different me's that we play. An employee, a parent, a friend. We have these different selves that we have in the world, can be the different rooms inside the house. And mine really refers to all the stuff that we put in the house. It encompasses all the material objects we consider as belonging to us. And so from the Buddhist perspective, the problem with this I, me, mine complex is that it leads to attachment. We cling to the positive and fear negative ones, as we heard in the Dharma talk earlier yesterday. It gives rise to dualities, a separation of self and other, and it creates both conflict internally and externally. It also is a problem because the self is impermanent, it's an illusion. So all aspects of this I, me, mine complex are subject to change, and clinging to a changing entity will lead to suffering. So in order to better understand the self, I talk about how the self is constructed across time. So I provide a neurophysiological and system-based model that attempts to explain what this is. And so chronometry really refers to the timing and the temporal structure of conscious perception. How fast and in what sequence of events unfold in the brain and give rise to awareness. And it's central to our understanding of how consciousness emerges and functions in real time. And if you're interested, it's in this Handbook of Mindfulness. So this model that I'm referring to is really described here, okay, as a string of moments Okay, a string of being me. So we have the I, me, mine complex, but we have a string of I, me, mine happening across time. Now each moment of experience involves these self-specifying processes that include somatic experience, and somatic processing refers to the way the body processes sensory information. It's very early in the attentional filtering of information. Then there's phenomenal awareness, which is present moment experience of what it's like. What are we experiencing right now? And then there's the cognitive and emotional phase of mental processing that's associated with evaluation, interpretation, and integration of all the conceptual and linguistic information. This is also facilitated by time. So it happens across a millisecond time scale, 500 milliseconds. For every 500 milliseconds, every time you see an object that comes out in front of you, the first thing that happens is your brain starts processing, is it relevant to you? What is this? Okay? You only start to identify it after 500 milliseconds. Remember, 500 milliseconds, it's like that. It's so quick, right? So we're really talking about a lot of processing that's happening before you even have awareness. Every moment there's a way that the body is processing information, and that is leading to your experience of being self. It's also fed by memory. Okay, so memory is also driving the predictive models of the world. Every experience you have then creates a predictive model of what it might be like next time you see that experience. And you're also having behavioral responses, which in the end, once you interpret what you see, there's also a response. What should you do with this object? Maybe I drink it because it's a special kind of barley water that's I've never had before, but I tried recently and it's quite good. So that whole experience is something that happens all in one 500 millisecond moment. And you can imagine there's about 63 million of those moments every year. So in about every experience that you have is contributing to what we call the reification of the self. It reifies or creates a sense of self-identity. Like all the habits, the mental habits, the fears, the wants, the desires that are created is really a conditional loop of selfing that happens across time. And we can say in about 3 billion moments, this little guy, this little baby over there, has then transformed into who is standing here in front of you today. So you can imagine then how many billions of moments have led to who you've become today. What have you done in the world? How have you processed the world in all those moments that you've had in your life? Now, these can also be mapped onto the Buddhist model of what we describe as storehouse consciousness, sense consciousness, mind and thinking judgment. You can also map the same model onto the Buddhist model of universal mental formations, where there's contact with a particular object. There's a feeling tone, Vedana. We talked about this described yesterday, which is the mental impulse or intention behind our actions. And attention really can happen later processing or early stages of processing. So this is really the model of how the self is experienced across time, these moments. So how does the self-reification of self-identity manifest into a clinical model of psychopathology? And by which mechanisms can meditation training be of help? So what happens when this system of selfing goes wrong is we can become stressed, anxious, depressed. That could lead to the reification, identification of you as a stressed or depressed person. There are close to 1 billion people on this planet now living with a mental health condition. And that is really a big problem. It's been increasing by 35% just between 2019 and 2020. This is one of the most common thoughts that people have who have depression or anxiety, that I'm losing control or I'm not good enough. And the understanding here is that if there is a high frequency of these kinds of thoughts, if they're causing potential risk of injury, or they're interfering socially with your relationships, they can lead to psychopathology, what we call inflammaging. Inflammaging really refers to the sort of negative impact of stress across all bodily systems, or cardiovascular disease. Just through thinking, these thoughts are contributing to that self-reification. It's leading to this conditioning of the self as a depressed individual, and it then leads to these forms of disease. So what is the solution here? The Dhammapada describes a potential mechanism, that our life is actually shaped by our mind. We become what we think. So based on this sort of idea that there's some way to transform our reified, depressed self, we can go to the wisdom of Thich Nhat Hanh, who says, in order to transform the seeds of suffering into seeds of happiness, one must only look deeply and see clearly that both are manifestations of our own consciousness. We need only to water the seeds of happiness and avoid watering the seeds of suffering. So the mechanism of meta-awareness is really just the ability for second-person knowledge of mental processing. So it can be non-conceptual, it can be non-propositional. It's awareness of awareness, right? So we can take these experiences of anger, anxiety, and fear, and sadness, and we can label them with our sensations. We can label them as thoughts. We can label them as feelings. And meditation does just that. And by doing that kind of process of becoming aware of our experience, we have what's called disidentification from that internal experience. We have reduced reactivity to that thought content. This is the mechanism of meta-awareness and decentering. You are removing yourself a bit from the reified self that identifies as someone who has anger, anxiety, or depression. So this thought of I'm not good enough, okay, this is the most common thought that people have when they're depressed. But the biggest transformative process that happens when you go through something like psychotherapy is that you have this distancing that you have between your thoughts and your own self-experience. That you're no longer not good enough. I'm having a thought, or I notice that I'm having a thought that I'm not good enough. And that distance is the psychotherapeutic mechanism by which you can have improvement and improve in your mental experience. So that is what we refer to as meta-awareness. That is the mechanism of what happens when you start to de-reify the self, unravel the identification with depression, and move into a healthier self. Okay. So let me just give you a little bit of background of what's happening. If you were to look at the brains of meditators and better understand how meditation is affecting their brains, it speaks to how this de-reification process happens, or this works. This is really just a model showing you how there are about 13 or 15 different networks in the brain that we identify at rest. And you can use those kinds of analyses to better understand how these networks interact with each other. And when you scan the brains of meditators, and there have been enough studies, and I'm only going to sort of show you a few, but these are a lot of the common studies that have been out there, and I've looked at all the data very clearly and thoroughly. And my read of the literature is really that there's impacts, very, very clear impacts across these 4 different networks. Okay, this is they're color-coded for you, but you have a dorsal attention network, you have a sensory network, and you have a central executive network. The green network is what we call the default mode network. And there's a frontal parietal control network. So I'll explain what those are. first let me just tell you what the results show you. So across all different types of meditation styles, okay, all different types of practices, whether it's cross-sectional data or whether it's pre-post data after a mindfulness intervention, you'll see increased activity in sensory parts of the brain. It makes sense. You're focusing on sensory experience with your thoughts and emotions and feelings. You also have increased activity in central executive networks, the ones that are controlling and keeping our working memory going. You have increased activity in attention networks and premotor networks, the ones that are working in the first half of that moment, right? The non-conscious processing. You're starting to dip into all of our negative biases that Kansen were talking about yesterday. The most important, though, is this frontal parietal control network, and I'll explain to you why. All the data seem to suggest that even when you're in a non-dual state of awareness, the highest state of meditation, you activate this particular network, the orange network, and it's central to this particular region here, frontal parietal cortex, and I'll explain that in a minute, and decreases in activity in the default mode network. And the default mode network is that self-evaluative network. It's the network that's responsible for rumination, for thinking, for evaluating yourself in a negative kind of way, and that just happens to be what we do when we're doing nothing, when our mind is wandering. Maybe some of you may be wandering right now and thinking about, I'm not good enough. But meditation helps us decrease activity in this network. Okay, so what's so important about this particular frontal parietal network? Well, here it is across all the other networks. It's a hub. It's a hub. It's not only a hub, but it's thought of as a circuit breaker. Okay, it means that it can disrupt activity across any other network that's active at any time, suggesting that it controls and allows you to flexibly switch or toggle between any other experience that you may be happening. If you're thinking about something internally, you have awareness to then let go of that experience and switch to another network or of activity. So it's the critical node, this frontal parietal network, in all the other networks. It includes, some people, I think, refer to the salience network as being important also. The salience network is just the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and insula, which are also part of this orange network, okay? Those are really important areas for monitoring awareness of the body signals. So this paper here shows how this particular brain region is one of the most evolved part of our brains. And early hominid ancestors developed this part of our brain. It makes us uniquely human. And that is the brain region that is most active in meditators. It's the area of the brain that is conserved, that is helping preserve atrophy from cognitive decline. It is critical for development of meta-awareness. And here's the slide that everyone has shown, who's shown any pictures of a brain, from a study that came from Sarah Lazar's lab back in 2005. And again, the most important point here is that the insula and the frontal polar cortex are the two brain regions that seem to be most active and not degrading in thickness across age. So there's regular age-related decline of the brain. Your brain is shrinking after age 21. You're losing neurons as you get older. But if you meditate, one of the best sort of data points of meditation research is that those individuals who are having normal age-related decline are protected from that decline through meditation practice. So it doesn't necessarily enhance cognition in a 20-year-old, but it protects 65-year-olds and up from losing that cognitive capacity. This is what this data really means. Okay, so here's the other mechanism, prosociality and self-transcendence. So we know that meditation makes you kinder and more considerate. There's a lot of data showing that trait mindfulness and brief mindfulness induction enhances other-oriented motivation, like empathic concern. You care about others. There's helping behaviors to socially excluded strangers. There's one study, one of my students actually, Paul Condon, he did a study where he showed that those individuals who train in mindfulness based program or a compassion-based program would offer their seat at a much higher rate compared with those who did not have meditation training, to someone who would look like they may be suffering. More pro-social types of behavior. And Emiliano will probably talk a little bit more about that. Tanya Singer, who's shown here in the MRI scanner, did this project called the Resource Project. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but it was a very extensive project that it's worth looking into. And she put people into 3 different groups who did core loving kindness and more constructive meditation practices. Some that looked at just perspective taking with observing thoughts, like more analytical. And then there were some that were focused on just attention. And I wanted to just point out, in terms of prosociality, is that the increased prosocial behaviors were correlated with fronto-insular cortical thickness. Again, the orange network, okay? The orange network refers to that frontal and parietal areas of the brain. They work together as a circuit breaker, okay? And those are the areas that were correlated most with prosocial behaviors, as that's what Tanya found. And so she also looked at empathy activated brain regions with pain and negative emotions. So there are some increased empathic responses to someone who is experiencing pain, but it was really the compassion meditation that was unique and showing, let's see here, the compassion activated area. So when they just practiced compassion and metta, love and kindness, they were linked to positive emotions, social affiliation, and reward brain regions. Okay, things like the ventral areas of the basal ganglia there, right, and the nucleus accumbens. So that's where compassion is more. It gives you reward, it gives you joy to be compassionate, and that's what we're seeing in this study that Tanya did. So I also need to tell you about what self-related processing is. It all refers to that process of being in the default mode, this evaluating the self. And we did this review that Eric also referred to yesterday on all the different mindfulness-based interventions and how it affects the self. And we looked at how meditation was, or how self was measured, and it was on a continuum of the self as a subject versus processes that are more conceptual, like self as object. And so there are different constructs that we were identified. But it really came down to this definition of self-related processing requires one to evaluate or judge some feature in relation to one's perceptual image or mental concept of oneself. Just really evaluating the world. It's distinct from the embodied, pre-reflective, self-specifying process that happens early stages of the self model that I spoke to earlier, right? It's distinct. So self-related processing, all of these concepts, these levels of self, positive relations with self, self-related abilities, bodily self, and negative relations with self are all related to that default mode network activity. But this is what was measured across all the different studies that we looked at for mindfulness. And what we found was that there were high levels of increased activity or increased levels of self-compassion and decreased rumination as a result of meditation practice. Now those are the highest effect sizes were found across those two constructs of self-related processing. But there was also there was also some increases in interoception or body awareness and embodiment, experience of being a self in the world. Okay, so those are the 3 areas of all the self-related processes that have been affected by mindfulness-based interventions. Self-compassion is like an interesting construct. It's been shown to improve health behaviors such as eating habits, exercise, sleep behaviors, quitting smoking, and stress management. It shows to be a key mechanism through which mindfulness-based interventions improve psychological outcomes. So there's something really powerful about self-compassion. It also predicts reductions in depression, anxiety, and stress. But there's something also that unique about this construct of self-compassion. It really speaks to this observation that we found, that mindfulness-related well-being is better explained and achieved by self-concept enhancement than Buddhist-derived ego quieting or reduction in self-related processing. So when we talk about reduction in suffering from the Buddhist model, it's to eliminate the self. The self is an illusion. We have to get rid of that self, right? It's just causing more suffering. But what we found across all these mindfulness-based interventions is that it was strengthening the self-concept. So self-compassion is one of those constructs that are actually enhancing our self-concept. So there's a little bit of controversy about how to interpret that and how that fits into the model of liberation from suffering from the Buddhist perspective. Okay, so the last mechanism that I'm going to talk about is how self is transformed is through self-transcendence. And the idea here is that the non-dual experience where subject and object duality dissolve gives us a better perspective on absolute reality. So non-dual awareness can be cultivated by a number of different practices, from the Vajrayana Dzogchen tradition on referential compassion, nature of mind training, pointing out the way, direct crossing. This is another practice, Tot Regal, allowing spontaneous luminous visions and experience of Rigpa. From the Hindu Vedanta traditions, not two, this is from Advaita. In the Theravada traditions, absorption or jhana practices also lead to Nirodha and Samapatti. So these are the practices that are often described as non-dual types of practices. So the most famous experiment that was done with non-referential compassion was done by Richard Davidson's group, Antoine Lutz, and they asked these meditators to use non-referential compassion. They hooked them up with EEG, and they found a very specific brain signature, this what are called gamma waves, that are typically 26 to 70 hertz, or usually over 40 hertz, around 40 hertz of frequency. It basically just synchronized brain activity across different parts of the frontal and parietal brain regions, that you saw this large-scale integration of distributed neural processing. So that's what's happening when you see this gamma band activity. It's when you have an insight or an aha moment, you see this gamma band activity. That's what's referred to in perceptual binding. It's also now found to be specific to anti-inflammatory or lymphatic activity in the brain, meaning all your metabolic waste that's removed from your brain is active when you stimulate the brain at this same frequency, 40 hertz, and gamma band. So something unique about what non-referential or non-dual compassion can do is also help clear out all the metabolic waste from your brain. And so what they found was specifically that if you look here, this was a resting state, and as soon as they started meditating, the gamma band activity turned on very high. And you see it here in both the frontal and parietal regions. Okay, the novices didn't show anything, the experts specifically in those frontal parietal regions. Now you should know by now that that's part of the orange network. The orange part of our brain, the frontal parietal network, remember how important that is for flexibly switching. It's the hub, it's the circuit breaker. It's very critical for developing meta-awareness. So gamma activity was higher in the baseline, resting state before meditation for the adepts. It's increased sharply during the non-dual meditation and remained higher after meditation. And there was this long-distance phase synchrony over those specific frontal and parietal electrodes. When we looked at another study of non-dual practice, pointing out the way, we just looked at different, is it called pointing out the way? This is a very specific form of practice. I'm just going to go over this really quickly. And what we saw was, if you look at the brain signature of what was happening as they moved from what was called the ordinary state of mind into a awakened state, fourth stage of this practice, you see this dramatic amplitude change mostly across all different types of brain frequencies, from theta, alpha, gamma, and gamma 2. So gamma between 29 to 44 hertz, there was an almost doubling in the amplitude of gamma band activity. Okay, so this is where there's awareness is stabilized from what's called the oceanic to a river flow. It's very non-dual. Just another marker for non-dual awareness. And now we're showing that non-dual awareness can also be associated with another marker in the brain, one of the most common markers in the brain, called frontal midline theta. So that's about 8 hertz. And in the frontal and midline structures of the brain, you see this frequency of activity when you're focused in your concentration practice. And Eric Garland recently showed that this frontal midline structures correlated with self-transcendence in his opiate use disorder patients. So people who were improving in their symptoms of opioid use disorder not only showed increases in self-transcendence, but that clinical change in opioid use also correlated with this theta, frontal midline theta, so and the experience of self-transcendence. He uses a scale called the NADA, which measures self-transcendence, and that correlates also. So there are some correlates now of self-transcendence. So really the take-home message really for today is that there are these 6 core practices, 4 primary mechanisms, and we have 18 different latent order mechanisms. We have the I-me-mind complex that I talked to you today, which is a conventional self, and how it has a specific chronometry that happens. Remember, we have 63 million moments every year. What are you going to do with those moments? How are you going to fill your mind? And we have a very specific mechanism that is located in the brain, in this frontal parietal control network for meta-awareness. Pro-social behavior, there are clear data to suggest that more mindfulness is going to make you more pro-social, and Emiliana will talk a little bit more about that. And that there's correlates for self-transcendence, that this gamma band activity correlates very uniquely with self-transcendence, and so does the frontal midline theta in clinical examples like Eric Garland's work with his self-report measure of self-transcendence. So that, with that, I wanted to also thank all the people who were part of that mindfulness research collaborative that Eric was talking about yesterday. Because without collaboration, there was really not as much impact. With the collaboration, we had great impact. So I'm really happy to thank all these collaborators. And then also, thank you to you for listening. I appreciate all of your time and space together.
네, 명상의 치유 원리를 알아볼 수 있는 강연이었습니다. 대단히 감사드립니다. 이제 그 강연 내용에 대해서 궁금한 점에 대해서 그 질문, 답변 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 저희가 사전 접수를 받을 당시에 몇 가지 질문들도 사전에 함께 선정해 두었습니다. 그 질문 지금 드려보겠습니다. 첫 번째 질문은요. 그 수행자가 정체기에 빠졌을 때 개인의 변화를 지속하기 위해서 어떤 접근법을 추천하실지, 그게 첫 번째 질문이었고요. 두 번째 질문입니다. 어떤 점이 우리 바고 선생님을 자기, 그 셀프라는 개념을 연구의 핵심 주제로 삼도록 만들었는지, 이게 궁금하고요. 또 자아의 비이원성에 대해서 눈을 뜨게 한 그 개인적인 학문적 또는 체험적 순간이 있었는지, 그것도 궁금하다고 해주셨고요. 그리고 가능하다면 앞으로 연구 방향에 대해서 같이 또 공유해 주실 수 있을지까지 질문을 주셨습니다. 우리 박오 선생님께서 한꺼번에 다 대답을 주시겠다고 하네요. 예, 부탁드리겠습니다. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't hear the translation. But I do remember the 2 questions that I was posed. Oh, here it is. Yes, okay. Okay, so here's my answer to this first question. I'm going to tell you a quick story. I was once at a conference with the Dalai Lama, and somebody asked His Holiness, what is the shortest amount of time to practice meditation to achieve benefit? And she was very serious. She's like, well, what's the minimum amount of time to practice it? This is the kind of question that I hear most often. How much do I have to practice meditation to achieve some benefit? And he looked at her and smiled, ha 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 ha, as he does, and he says, lifetime. Suggesting it takes a lifetime of practice to get some benefit. So I say that with, with some seriousness, is that even if there's a plateau in your practice, that there's an opportunity there. It signals an opportunity and a challenge. If you feel like your meditation is not really getting you anywhere, it could mean that there's some stabilization of your gains, that some things that you've been practicing that you're doing well, something you're doing well, that you're not losing anything. But it also could be some sort of subtle resistance to going deeper. And so I think there are some practical tips that for what happens if you want to continue your personal transformation. You can go back to the basics. The Satipatthana Sutta spoke directly about one practice, breath meditation. And sometimes we forget how strong of a practice that can be, to continually go back to your breath, and be aware of your breath, be aware of distraction, and come back to the breath. And then there's also I think the other tip would be, think about beginner's mind, about how great it is to deliberately cultivate curiosity towards any ordinary experience. Right? This can dissolve the sort of automaticity. It can restore freshness in your practice. You could try other practices, like walking meditation. There are other practices where you can vary the object, shift your attentional anchors. You can adjust the intensity, how long, the duration of your practice. There are so many different ways that you can deepen the context and intentions of your practice. But I do go back to the advice of His Holiness that it could take lifetimes, not just one, to achieve benefit. So may we continue to work together to get to that level. So I think that answers question number one. Then the question was, what led me to study the concept of self as a central theme? I think it's a beautiful question. I really think that the self is, I had a taste, I think, of non-dual insight in my first Vipassana course when I was about 20 years old. And it was a profound experience for me that I got super curious about it. I was also a cognitive neuroscientist in training, so studying the mind and the brain. And to have that first-person experience of something so profound as a non-dual, what I thought was some taste of non-dual experience, got me very interested in what that was. And how it relates to the mind and the brain and being a self and who I am. So I think that's what was my original motivation for studying the self. And if I could share a direction of my future research, well, one of the things I'm very excited about, and most people around me always hear me talking about it, is a study that I'm just about to publish. It's almost ready for publication. I'm waiting for the last small reviews for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's looking at how meditation affects the glymphatic system. The glymphatic system of the brain is what we call the metabolic waste clearance system. It's the real brainwashing. It's when you go to sleep at night, the restorative effects of sleep are that you remove all the metabolic waste that you accumulate throughout the day. And if you don't do that, if you don't sleep, if you have sleep problems, you'll have much more deficits in your cognitive capacity. And as we get older, over 70, typically you have poorer sleep. And that leads to more accumulation of things like plaques and tangles and alpha-beta proteins that lead to Alzheimer's disease, muscular sclerosis, Parkinson's disease. Lots of these neurodegenerative diseases are due to the buildup of metabolic waste. And what we found recently was when we looked at meditators compared to people who just had controlled breathing, that the meditator showed increased activity in this lymphatic system, suggesting that one of the benefits of doing meditation, these were adepts, people who were meditating at least a few hours a week at least for many years, but that there was a correlation with the expertise. So the more they practiced, the more activity that they had in this lymphatic system, the more that they were removing metabolic waste. So that's very exciting to think that meditation has a direct impact on helping the brain move metabolic waste through its sort of channels that are in your penetrating arteries of your brain. Yes, so.
Thank you so much for your precious lecture and Q&A session. Thank you again.
Okay, 감사합니다.
네, 멋진 강연 그리고 명쾌한 질의응답까지 모두 감사를 드립니다. 우리 데이비드 바고 박사님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 우리가 명상이 흔히 좋다 하는데 도대체 어떻게 좋은 건지, 명상을 통해서 우리가 자아 개념이 어떻게 변화될 수 있는지에 대해서 우리 데이비드 바고 선생님께서 그 치유 원리에 대해서 현대적 언어로 우리 신경학적인 그런 기전을 원리를 바탕으로 해서 그 우리가 치유를 하고 또 우리 자기 변화에 어떤 과정을 거치면서 우리가 변화를 겪게 되는지에 대해서 아주 상세히 설명을 해 주셨습니다. 대단히 감사합니다. 네, 이제 두 번째 세션으로 들어가겠습니다. 그 두 번째 세션은요, UC 버클리 대학 Great Good Science Center 과학 디렉터이신 에밀리아나 사이먼 토마스 박사님께서 친절 챙김을 찾아서 친사회적 실천이 어떻게 건강과 웰빙을 증진하는가, 이런 주제로 준비해 주셨습니다. 시차가 많이 나는 시간임에도 불구하고요, 저희와 소통하시기 위해서 온라인으로 여러분들을 기다리고 계십니다. 그럼 큰 박수로 우리 에밀리아나 박사님을 맞이해 보겠습니다. Hello, Dr. Emiliana. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please say hello to the audience. I think you're on mute. Excuse me? Dr. Emiliana? 지금 5초 정도 지연 상태가 있어서요. 잠시만 기다려 주십시오. Dr. Emiliana, I think you're on mute. Dr. Emiliana, wait a moment.
How pro-social practices boost health and well-being. And as you heard earlier, my name is Emiliana Simon Thomas, and I'm the Science Director at the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. My background is in neuroscience and social psychology. I studied how emotions activate different pathways in the brain, different structures, and different processes in the body, and how these influence decision-making and thinking. And in that trajectory of work, I became more and more interested in how our thoughts and our awareness of our thoughts and our awareness of our emotions had an impact on our well-being in life. At the Greater Good Science Center, we keep track of the latest scientific research on well-being, on health, and the ways that our connections with other people, our tendency towards generosity, and our feelings of belonging and contributing in a meaningful way to our communities actually enhance and support our overall well-being. But tonight I wanted to talk about this idea of kindfulness, which I borrowed from a British monk who was trained in the Theravadan tradition named Ajahn Brahm. And he cultivated this term, kindfulness, to basically represent the space of overlap between kindness, and kindness can be a thought or a feeling or a gesture or a behavior, and mindfulness, which we've been talking about together for this whole time, right? This awareness, non-judgmental awareness of our own inner processes. So any practice or exercise or overall attitude or demeanor that combines kindness and mindfulness, I define, following again the model of Ajahn Brahm, as kindfulness. Many of the practices, reflections, meditations, or mindfulness exercises that involve kindness or that bring in an element of exercising kindness will use phrases like the one on this slide. May I, you, she, he, or they, and all sentient beings be safe, well, happy, and peaceful. So, one of the reasons why kindfulness is linked to health and well-being is because humans are amongst a number of species, primarily mammals, that actually need connection to survive. I'm showing you an illustration from a paper that exhibits the relationships between social connection or social advantage and survival. And because of our rich dynamics with each other, with ourselves, with our communities, we have a difference, a variation in how connected a person might feel. And that degree of connection is strongly predictive of survival over the course of the lifespan. In fact, a couple of other charts from this same study that was led by Noah Snyder-Mackler shows that across a number of different physical health conditions, having a stroke, suffering from asthma, heart disease, or bronchitis, the more connected a person is, the less likely they are to suffer from that particular ailment. On the right is a figure that looks at the relationship between social belonging. They use the term social network index here. The more integrated a person is, the more likely it is that they will still be alive in a study that surveyed people in a longitudinal fashion. They might survey them 5 years, 5 years later, 5 years later, and those who had these strong, supportive connections were much more likely to be alive. And in fact, low social integration, so lacking that connection to one's own mind and feelings, close others, and community, predicts a 50% increase in all-cause mortality risk in humans. So connections are so important to our life. And one of the theories that tries to explain why humans need connections for health and well-being is called the social baseline theory. This theory, which was developed by James Cone and David Sabara, argues that people actually find the world an easier place to navigate when they are in proximity to familiar and predictable other people. Doesn't necessarily have to be other people. Sometimes people can experience that same comfort through connection with pets, or even something spiritual. So here, social baseline theory argues that as a normal condition, humans expect to be in the company of each other. And this is one of the reasons why taking connection away, or being isolated, or being lonely is actually harmful. It's a stressor to the human physiological systems, mental processes, and overall health and well-being. One of my favorite studies that provides evidence for the social baseline theory asked people to rate the steepness of a hill. And the experimenters asked people just walking by themselves, how steep was a hill that was behind them? And they asked people who were walking with a friend, how steep is the hill behind me? And when people were walking with a friend, they perceived that hill to be less steep. So again, this is an example of the way that humans we are in the company of each other. So that's one of the theories that explains the importance of connection. So how do we get connected? And what are the methods and the strategies that help us connect with one another? Well, fortunately, humans have evolved as a species with an innate prosociality. So prosocial is a state or a behavior that serves the welfare of another. And we have evolved with an intrinsic motivation or urge to behave in this way. One of the reasons we need to behave in this way is because we, like our primate predecessors, give birth to very vulnerable offspring. And so we need to have systems that motivate us to caregive for long periods of time without necessarily expecting reciprocity. We also need motivation and processes that encourage us to approach one another and affiliate, to form bonds with one another, to come together so that we can coordinate our effort to achieve goals that are perhaps impossible to accomplish in solitude. We also need systems that motivate us to reconcile after experiencing disagreement, after encountering or being involved in some kind of conflict. While there is a popular narrative that humans enjoy hostility and aggression and conflict, and that primates also behave in this way, it is actually less common and mostly the exception that humans will engage and feel motivated to engage in this way, and more common for humans to prefer to be in a peaceable and collaborative kind of relationship or collective with one another. So we have skills and the urge to reconcile. That's part of our prosociality. And then finally, because we are an ultra-social species, because we live in large collectives, part of our prosociality is what gives rise to culture, right? This agreement on morality and appropriateness and virtue and goals that we share that we call culture. So prosociality is a driver of our care, our ability to form social bonds, our ability to manage social bonds through times of goodness and difficulty, and the formation of community and culture. When scholars want to argue that we have evolved with a particular capacity, and in this case, prosociality, The next question is often, well, are there systems in the body and the brain that actually support this kind of functioning? And in fact, there are. There are at least 4 different pathways and combinations of structures that function in a way to support pro-social thinking and decision-making. They're all in different colors on this illustration, but in light blue, there are areas of the brain, the temporal parietal junction, the superior temporal sulcus, the temporal pole, that are exquisitely dedicated to helping us understand each other's expressions and perspectives on the world. This is called mentalizing. There are areas that are dedicated to helping us resonate or simulate one another's emotional experiences for the better and sometimes in a challenging way. We experience empathic laughter and joy and pride, and we also experience empathic distress, where we feel upset when we encounter another person who is also experiencing some kind of difficulty. There are areas in our brain that are involved in helping us reconsider or have a heightened awareness of the situation when we confront another person who is suffering or some kind of challenge. These areas are here marked in yellow, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it helps us regulate and control our own experiences when we are encountering another person or situation that calls on our empathy, that makes us feel like we want to do something. And then finally, close to the front and underneath of our brain are structures in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum that help us assess our potential to make a difference, that help us decide how to invest resources into supporting the welfare of another and to anticipate the benefit of actually investing in the welfare of another. For example, there's a lot of evidence that shows that when people act kindly, behave in ways that are generous towards others, this activates the pathways in the brain that also signal reward or pleasure when we receive something that perhaps we've been desiring. This is called the warm glow effect. So once again, our biology is designed or evolved in a way that drives us to be pro-social. And this is part of our evolution, and it's part of what helps us connect with one another in ways that serve our health and well-being. So another few points about prosociality. Human babies actually prefer a pro-social character. So scholars who look at babies and pay attention to what they pay attention to and what they're interested in have been able to demonstrate that babies like looking at something that is generous and kind and understanding and supportive more than they like looking at something that is selfish and confrontational or hostile or self-serving, exploiting for their own gain. When we, as adults in the world, see babies, they disproportionately draw or engage that pro-social sensibility. Most of us, if I were to show you a number of pictures of really cute babies, you would lean forward and make a face that is very nurturing and maybe even a sound like, oh, right? This is very universal, that urge to caregive around babies. When scholars try to capture how pro-social people are given a choice, if you're given a choice to be pro-social and fair and generous, or a choice to be self-interested and to take more than you give, people tend to make the generous choice more often, and they tend to make it more quickly. It takes more effort and more resources. Things like oxygenated blood or glucose in the brain. You have to use more of that. in order to respond to a choice to be selfish or generous in a selfish way. So the first impulse is not to be selfish. The first impulse for humans is to be generous. When scholars measured what happened when different groups of people were instructed to do different exercises in the context of a kind of happiness, which is called eudaimonia, which is your sense of meaning and purpose, that who you are matters in the world. And they compared people who did something very open-minded, that's the yellow bar in this chart, to people who did something very boisterous and extroverted, that's the light pink bar, to people who did something nice for themselves, some kind of thing that made them feel better in their own right. And then finally on the right, farthest right, to people who did acts of kindness for others. What they found was that group who did acts of kindness for others actually reported the biggest gain to their sense of meaning and purpose, to that kind of happiness that is about your values and what matters to you in the world. So these are all ways that prosociality plays such an important role in connection, our ability to connect with our values, with each other, in ways, again, that ultimately are of service to our health and well-being. I also wanted to share the pitfalls of avoiding prosociality. So I already spoke about that it takes more effort to be selfish, to do things that only lead to your own gain and deprive others or harm others. But it also feels bad, right? We have these specific emotions, and I give examples here, guilt and shame. Those are how we feel when we choose to avoid opportunities to be kind and generous, to be prosocial, to invest in the welfare of others. Another example is if we stifle or suppress our kindness, if we try to not be generous or not look at other people who are suffering. This is often one of the main causes of burnout, of feeling like you're disconnected from the world. People tend to experience loneliness, and at aggregate levels, if lots and lots of people are all avoiding or suppressing their prosociality, this is thought to be a source of civil unrest. I already talked about how good it feels to behave in ways that uplift the welfare of others, but I'll share one more piece of that, which is not only do our reward pathways get activated when we know we've done something to benefit another person, we also empathize positively with people who are experiencing relief and gratitude towards us when we choose to do things that are kind and generous towards others. The figure on this slide is from an article which reviewed many different studies that asked people to give, to be generous, to invest their own resources into some avenue that would benefit others, that would uplift the welfare of others, and looked at how that impacted their well-being. And for each of these lines that are horizontal with a shape in the middle, that's the value of the benefit to well-being, to a positive outcome to their mental health. And all of those horizontal lines with shapes in them are to the right of zero. There's a thicker vertical line that's zero. And this is work by Laura Ackman and Elizabeth Dunn, which they've done for years, demonstrating this benefit of prosociality, this health and well-being benefit of prosociality that comes up again and again in the academic research. So, how does this tie back into kindfulness? Well, it turns out that practicing prosociality is an engine or a source of strengthening kindfulness, and that there are lots of different ways to exercise prosociality that can build our kindfulness. I'm showing you a graphic. This is not a biological or medical figure on this slide. Rather, it's more of a creative interpretation of where different functions in the brain are related to structures and pathways. Once again, this is not a scientific figure, but more of an inspiration, right? A creative inspiration to take into account all of the different ways that people can exercise prosociality in the service of kindfulness. So at the Greater Good Science Center, we are focused on trying to provide as many opportunities and resources to people as we can, drawing from rigorous experimental research to give people resources they can use in their daily lives. And one of those is a website called Greater Good in Action. Greater Good in Action is a library of exercises, activities, and practices, all of which have been studied in empirical intervention research. So a scholar does an experiment, they show that a particular practice, and for example, one of the practices that we know is really beneficial is spending time and connecting with nature. Right? Connecting with nature has benefits to health and well-being, lowers blood pressure, it evokes feelings of awe, it feels nice, people enjoy it, and it creates a sense of common humanity, of connection with all things. And so the Greater Good in Action website, if you were to click on one of these smaller boxes, you would get more detailed instructions for how to do this exercise. And furthermore, we provide the citation and the reference material associated with that particular practice. We're very committed to tying every activity, exercise, and practice to the original source research. And many of the practices involve reflection, contemplation, awareness, mindfulness, and all of them, to some extent or another, are linked to our potential for kindness, for being more generous and kind and connected to each other. So we launched this website and then realized that this was a magnificent opportunity to do some research. And in this case, we designed 2 programs that were interactive on the GGIA platform. And each of these programs is meant both to be a supportive way for people to practice a variety of different activities and exercises that can build kindfulness, and also a way for us and our scholar research team to develop a greater understanding of how practicing multiple different exercises and activities can actually improve health and well-being. And so we created one that is just 1 week long for folks who would prefer to do something for a short amount of time and see how it benefits them. And we also have a longer 28-day or 4-week program. And I'm just going to tell you about the different experiments that we have been conducting with these 2 platforms to contribute to the scientific understanding of how to strengthen kindfulness in the service of health and well-being. I'll start with the Big Joy Project. So the Big Joy Project was it was inspired by a documentary film called Mission Joy, which told the story of the close friendship between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So they were both pioneers in their communities, and they both had a tremendous amount of resilience and fortitude in pursuing their agenda of improving goodness and the quality of life for others in their communities. The filmmakers were Peggy Callahan and Jolene Smith, and they wanted to offer the public a way to do something for themselves and for each other after being inspired by this film. And so they reached out to Alyssa Appel and myself. Alyssa Appel is a professor of psychiatry at the University of California in San Francisco. And she and I thought, well, this would be a wonderful opportunity to use our Greater Good in Action platform to create an intervention that we can test. And so that is how we came up with the Big Joy Project. I'll tell you how it's designed. Anybody who joins fills out a survey that's called the enrollment survey. We ask something about themselves and their lives. We measure their well-being. For 7 days, each day, we give them an exercise or an activity or a practice. And we ask them before and after they do that, how they're feeling. We send the practice to them by email and by text message. And at the end of 7 days, we ask them to fill out a survey again so that we know what the difference is between day 1 and day 8. And we also provide the person with a report, a little visual illustration of how the exercises and activities that they tried had an impact on their well-being. So the Big Joy Project has 7 different exercises, but there's a first one, which is a little bit of a tester, and it's called Share a Laugh. And just so that you can have a feeling for what that's like, I'm gonna actually invite you to experience the Share a Laugh. This is a shared amusement practice that is known or has been shown to actually evoke positive emotions in participants. So maybe for a moment, roll your shoulders back, take a deep breath, and this is only 1 minute. Just embrace the sound and yeah, enjoy. Well, I can't hear you in the room, but I'm hoping that what happened is that several of you felt the urge to chuckle yourselves, and that moment really was uplifting. Once a person tries that, we invite them to join the study, and they get 7 more exercises. And one of them is thinking about and writing down 8 things that you're grateful for, or you're posting them into the platform. One of them is thinking a little bit differently in a more distanced way about a moment in your life that might have been more difficult. One of them instructs people to get into a conversation with another person about something positive, about something uplifting, about something inspiring. One of them is a video where you watch something that's really awe-inspiring. Another is actually a deliberate, guided audio meditation on loving kindness and your potential to be an agent of support in the world. One of them invites participants to reflect on their values and to put them into a ranked order and write about how the most important one shows up in their life. And then finally, there's an invitation to engage in kindness, to actually do kind things for other people. So these are the 7 things that people do on a daily basis. in the Big Joy program. This is an example of what the surveys look like before and after. So we ask people a number of different questions, but just for example, we measure people's emotions in 3 different families. So the first one is hopeful, optimistic, and encouraged, because we know, for example, that optimism is also a predictor of longevity and health over the lifespan. We ask about wonder and amazement, or awe. There's an emerging science about the importance of that kind of curiosity and wonder. I actually heard Dave Vago in the previous talk, when he was answering questions, talk about the importance of trying something new and being curious and engaging with that sense of wonder. And then the third one is amusement, right? Fun-loving, silliness. It turns out play and levity are very core to the human experience, and the extent to which we can activate that in our lives or experience or prioritize that is a predictor of our ability to be kind to others, right? We know that when we're unable to be kind and experience joy in our own right, it's more difficult to be kind and support others. Each time a person gets an activity in Big Joy, we use this little diagram on the left to ask them to tell us how positive do they feel, how unpleasant do they feel. We give them the exercise and instructions. We offer them a chance to just take notes freely or post whatever is coming to mind. Again, it's a little bit of an invitation to reflect, to have that awareness, to connect with what's happening in their own bodies. And then we ask them again how they're feeling. And this allows us to do some analyses where we can measure the immediate impact of engaging in these kinds of pro-social practices. We invite people in the evening again to tell us how they're feeling and reflect, and to actually give us a little bit of insight into their expectations. One of the things about any kind of activity, exercise, or practice is that if a person believes it's going to work and expects it's going to work, it's going to make them feel better or improve their well-being, it's actually more likely to do that. And so we want to be able to control for that and know that these activities reliably impact people's well-being, regardless of whether they expect them to. At the end of 7 days, when people fill out all of those surveys and answer all of those questions, we create a little feedback leaderboard for them. So on the left, we tell them, how much did your well-being change from day 1 to day 7? How much did it change? We give them also a change in their resilience, how connected they feel, how positive they feel as a result of doing each of these exercises. Remember, one of the ways that we describe Big Joy is that it was a citizen science project. And what that means is that we're hoping to give every person who participates some insight into the science themselves. We want them to feel like they're learning and contributing to bigger understanding. And this is one part of that. So the third chart is, which practice seemed to be most impactful for you in terms of your positive and negative feelings? And then finally on the right, we asked people, like, which practice was easiest to do, or after each practice, was it easy? Did you feel like it was a good fit? And so the hope is that at the end, if there's a lot of variance there, any person can go, you know what? The one that worked best for me was the gratitude list. I'm gonna start doing more of that in my daily life now that I've finished this program. Or maybe there are people for whom they all work the same and they have more options and choices. So I'm gonna tell you about a little bit of the science that we've done with the data that we gathered from the Big Joy Project. The first is just trying to understand who did this. Like, how well did it work? How many people did we get? We got over 100,000 people from around the globe who engaged with the Big Joy program. In fact, anybody who thinks this might be interesting is welcome to go and join right now, if you like. But this data is from data from people who already participated. And what we learned was that actually there is a certain number of demographic factors that predict, and psychological factors that predict whether or not a person is going to join Big Joy and whether or not they're going to continue to stick with it, to persist and do all 7 of the practices. In the program, we call the practices micro acts because they all do take a very brief amount of time. And the idea was we didn't want to make someone feel like they had to commit to a very long and extensive practice, but rather they could just get a little taste and learn something about themselves that might launch a bigger objective or behavior change. So it turns out that people who are a little bit older, people who are from the United States, people who have more privilege tend to be more likely to join and more likely to complete the full 7 days of Big Joy. So there are some things that we're learning about how we might need to shift or adapt or modify the program so that it can be more accessible and interesting and appealing to people who are outside of those demographic factors. But when we looked at impact of the people who did finish, right? So we know that we can pull out people who finished the opening enrollment survey, people who finished the ending survey, and we can compare their well-being from before to after. In fact, we did have a significant improvement in well-being, and you can see that only 17,000 people were in this particular sample. People's positive emotions were increased after compared to before, so the after is in light blue highlight and the before is in yellow. People's agency or feeling of control over their happiness. Here we call it happiness, but really it's the same as well-being. But they're feeling that I'm in charge, I can play a role in and impact my own happiness was greater after compared to before. People's stress, their perceived stress in life, decreased as a function of doing the Big Joy project. Their health improved as a small improvement, but it's very impressive to show that a person's physical health would improve over 7 days as a result of a very brief behavior each day. So even though it's a very small effect, it's still pretty remarkable. And then people reported that they slept better. So there are all these ways that this brief, combination of different ways of exercising pro-sociality in order to strengthen connection can improve health and well-being. We also looked at whether there were moderators. So were there other factors that predicted how great a person's benefit would be? And it turns out that, interestingly, the people who tended to drop off were also the ones, if they stayed, tended to benefit more. So younger people who stayed with the whole 7-day program benefited more. They had a bigger improvement to well-being. People who had less privilege, people who reported having high financial strain, they benefited more. People who were not from our most common demographic group, which were white people or Caucasian people from the United States, they benefited more when they stayed along with the program for the full 7 days. And people who had achieved less education benefited more. So there's very interesting things we're learning from what the potential is for practicing activities and exercises that strengthen kindfulness, and how to maybe design it in a way that can be most beneficial to the largest number of people. We were also interested in pro-sociality, right? Does practicing these exercises make someone more likely to endorse a statement like, I've made people feel cared for and supported? And this chart, or this figure, these 3 different charts show that, in fact, the more activities people did, so if they did 7 activities all 7 days, there was a bigger change in what we called interpersonal prosociality. That is, I've helped people, I've made people feel cared for, but we were also interested in something called universal prosociality, which is being willing to make sacrifices to your quality of life for the benefit of others' quality of life, people you don't know, or for the benefit of the natural environment. And it turns out that doing these 7 exercises led to a greater endorsement. People were more likely to say, yes, I do feel this way. I am more willing to make sacrifices to my quality of life in service of the natural environment after they had done these 7 micro acts. So again, with each of these studies, I'm sharing with you the lead authors, so Orson Shu from Columbia University and Darwin Guevara, who is a faculty at the Miami University of Ohio. So these are my friends and colleagues. Just for reference purposes, these are the actual citations for where this work has been published. And we have one more study that's in process that is focused on the actual pre-post emotion rating. So remember, every time a person does just one thing, we measure whether they say that they feel more positive or whether how their negative emotions feel, whether that changes. And as a sneak peek, and this is work by Robin Blades, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Los Angeles. In fact, each of the activities do reliably and statistically significantly improve positive feelings and reduce negative feelings, and the effect is cumulative. So each time a person does another one, they're more likely to report even increased positive feeling and decreased negative feeling. So that's the Big Joy Project. I'll spend just a few more minutes sharing with you the other program that we're in the midst of studying, which is a 4-week program called the Pathway to Happiness. Much like the Big Joy program, the Pathway to Happiness starts with an enrollment survey. We ask people about themselves and their lives. We also ask people to tell us about their own virtues. How important is something like compassion to them? How important is forgiveness? How important is empathy? How important is for generosity and kindness? And we, of course, assess their well-being. In the Pathway to Happiness, we give a practice each week, and we invite people to do it a couple times. So the week starts, we might say, okay, this week you're doing a mindfulness meditation, and 2 days later we'll remind them, 2 days later we'll remind them, and at the end of the week we'll ask a couple of questions about whether they did it and how it felt, and then we'll switch to a new practice. And after 4 weeks, we do a closing survey. So again, very experimentally designed so that we can learn something about the impact of engaging with these practices from a global sample for free. The Pathway to Happiness, because it's 4 weeks and there's more flexibility, any person who joins might get one of 31 different exercises. So I'm not going to read through these 4 columns, but there is a richer combination of possibility. The Big Joy Project really just uses 7. Pathway to Happiness, you might get an awe walk as your exercise or your activity. You might get a letting go of anger through compassion, guided mindfulness practice. So there are a number of different activities that different people get. And once again, our goal at the Greater Good Science Center, myself and my colleagues, is to try to understand how different practices work, how impactful each one is, whether some work better for some people than others, and whether we can understand the relationship between the impact on kindfulness and the person who joins the program. Are there certain practices that are more beneficial for an individual based on what matters to them and what they care about and who they are? This is all the work that we're trying to understand through this platform. We're still in the early stages of analyzing the data from this work. There are two scholars who are close. They've submitted papers to the Journal of Positive Psychology. My colleague Everett Wechsler, he did the same kind of analysis to try to understand who joins and who stays in a full 28-day program based on our demographic and psychological measures. And then Kristen Layuz, who is a professor at Cal State University East Bay, was really interested in what happens if we compare people who joined the Pathway to Happiness, who got a sequence of activities that fit what they thought they were most interested in, or what they had the most skill on, or if we gave them a sequence of activities that addressed what maybe they were not so strong in, right? Should we give people what they don't know how to do? Or should we give people what they really like and know how to do and hope that they'll be more likely to do it because it feels like a good fit? Or do we give people what they have a lot of room to grow on? Or is it just random? So the results are forthcoming, comparing those interventions on the Pathway to Happiness. So I just want to remind us that kindfulness is the space of overlap between mindfulness and kindness. And the way to build kindfulness is through activities and exercises and practices that make you more aware of and strengthen your tendency or urge to behave pro-socially, to be pro-social. And this can be through reflective and contemplative and mindfulness exercises, and it can be indirectly through writing exercises or social activities where you're very intentionally behaving in a kind and nurturing and friendly way. And our data is suggesting that these kinds of practices and activities and exercises that may use phrases like may I, you, she, he, or they, and all sentient beings be safe, well, happy, and peaceful. That those kinds of activities that make you think that way and change your orientation to yourself, others, and the world in a way that is kind actually benefits your health and well-being. I want to share all the resources that the Greater Good Science Center makes available for free globally. This slide maybe already has been made available to you, but we teach a lot of courses online. We have multiple pages that are like our Greater Good in Action page that also support people who want to learn more about kindfulness and the relationship between kindfulness and our overall health and well-being. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you for joining this conference and for giving me your attention so generously. I know it's difficult to absorb a presentation that is virtual. I wish I was there in Seoul in person with you. And it means a lot to me to know that I'm able to share the work that I do with my colleagues and the ideas and discoveries that so many other scholars have accomplished in the last 30 and 40 and 50 years that scholars have been studying mindfulness and kindness and pro-sociality. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Now we will begin Q&A session. 네, 멋진 강연이었습니다. 감사드립니다. 저희가 사전 접수를 받을 당시에 몇 가지 질문들도 사전에 함께 선정해 두었습니다. 그 질문 지금 드려보겠습니다. Dr. Emiliana? 이게 좀 테크니컬 딜레이가 있는 것 같아요. Dr. Emiliana, can you hear me now? Dr. Emiliana.
Okay.
Yeah. When we took the pre-registrations for this event, we also collected some questions in advance. I'd like to ask you one of those selected questions now. Got it? First question is, when someone struggles with self-criticism, what would be a good way to shift into self-compassion?
Thank you. That is such a wonderful question. It's wonderful question. Whoops. 1 second. Okay, thank you. When you're struggling with self-criticism, how can you move into or strengthen self-compassion? Well, my answer to that is that kindfulness. If you remember connection, when I first introduced it, there were 3 types of connection. There was connection to yourself, and connections to others, and connection with community and beyond, connection with others in a broader collective way. And prosociality is the mechanism that motivates and drives us to connect in those ways. But prosociality doesn't mean only investing in the welfare of others. One of my friends and colleagues, Kristen Neff, is really the author of or the pioneer of science into self-compassion. And self-compassion she describes as having 3 main dimensions. There's a mindfulness dimension, there's a care and nurturance dimension, and there's a common humanity, a shared humanity dimension to it. And that's very similar to how I was talking about connection, right? There's connection with yourself, there's connection with others, and there's connection with the community. So prosociality doesn't always focus on investing in the welfare of others. It is about investing in welfare. And you as a person are part of that welfare. And so any kind of mindfulness exercise that strengthens awareness of what's happening in your mind and your body also has a pro-social potential. Like, am I suffering? Is there something that's harming me? And if so, I should apply the same supportiveness and grace and connection to myself that I would offer to another person who might be struggling. There's lots of evidence that people who are pursuing goals are more successful if they score higher on measures of self-compassion than if they score higher on measures of self-criticism. Self-criticism is not a promise-saving route to achieving goals, despite popular opinion that perhaps that is the way to be successful and to achieve. In fact, adopting a stance of kindness towards your own suffering and awareness of your suffering, right? There's that mindfulness part of it, and a kindness towards that suffering, even your own, is as important as the kindness that you might offer a close friend or another person who is experiencing distress or difficulty. So there are a number of practices, and several of them are on the Greater Good in Action website, that are actually focused explicitly on self-compassion. Remember that the phrase is may I, right? It starts with may I. And there's lots of other targets that are in the phrase, but may I be safe and calm and at ease and free from suffering, right? May I also experience joy and happiness and contentment. It's as important as your capacity to offer that kindness and generosity to others. But it's not trivial, and it takes practice, just like everything else. You could do it for 7 days, for 5 minutes each day, and see if that makes a difference. Or it may be something that takes more time and more effort to really develop the muscle of directing that compassion, that kindness towards your own pain and suffering.
Thank you. Next question is, in Korea, there are still limited opportunities to learn concepts like kindness. If children could learn and practice these values early, especially within the first social environment they encounter, such as the family, it would be incredibly useful. Do you have any suggestions on how parents can take the lead and cultivate a family culture that teaches and practices kindness at home?
All right, thank you. I did not hear you ask that question, but I do think I know what the question was. It's my understanding that the question was about how parents might most effectively strengthen and build and encourage kindfulness in their families with their children. How can adults, whether they're caregivers or parents or teachers, do more to support kindfulness during developmental stages? And my favorite answer to that question is by presenting children with opportunities to actually behave in kind and generous ways in their own contexts. And part of that is through role modeling. So if you're a parent and your child is spending time with you and your family and in your household, they're watching. They're watching how you behave. They're watching the priorities that you make. And they're observing how you speak and interact out in the community. So it's really important as adults, as parents, to actually role model kindfulness. And that may mean having your child with you and showing them what a practice of kindfulness actually looks like, right? Actually inviting your child to maybe not make a list of 8 things that they feel grateful for, but tell them the 8 things that you listed and then ask them to list 3, right? Invite them in to the same activities and exercises and practices that you're trying in order to strengthen your kindfulness, in order for them to see that that's the norm. That's the expected and ordinary way to walk through the world. I think a lot of times parents just want to tell kids how to do it. You do it this way, but kids are watching and they want to see you actually behave and practice in ways that strengthen kindfulness and self-compassion, to relate back to the earlier question. Can you show or role model what it looks like to actually acknowledge and honor and nurture yourself through a time of difficulty so that your children see that that is the healthy and normal thing to do? That's my favorite answer to that question. Of course, other opportunities or options are to present media that exemplifies kindfulness. So you have a choice of things to watch on television or on other digital sources or books to read. And as a parent, now that you understand what kindfulness is and you have a relationship to how to actually find ways to be kind and to recognize kindness and mindfulness, make sure that that's the kind of content and media that you are presenting, giving, and sharing with your children. So modeling, role modeling, giving, sharing, offering, and together engaging with media and content that exemplifies kindfulness feels like the most promising way to inculcate those values and that attitude in children.
Thank you for your precious lecture and Q&A session. Thank you once again. 네, 멋진 강연 그리고 명쾌한 질의응답까지 모두 감사드립니다. 지금까지 에밀리아나 사이먼 토마스 박사님이었습니다. 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 신사회적 실천이 그 웰빙에 주는 영향을 우리 내과학에 기반해서 설명해 주셨습니다. 또한 그 Greater Good Science Center의 구체적인 프로그램과 사례를 소개해 주셨는데요. 특히 빅조이 프로젝트가 굉장히 인상적이었던 것 같습니다. 네, 아침부터 열심히 달려왔습니다. 벌써 점심시간이 되었는데요. 점심시간은 교내에서는 상록원, 교외에서는 충무로역 또는 동대 입구역 인근 식당을 이용하시면 됩니다. 이런 시간 함께 해주신 여러분께 감사드립니다. 맛있는 식사 하시고요. 저희는 1시 30분 세 번째 세션에서 다시 만나 뵙겠습니다. 감사합니다.